Lucky. Faculty don't always have such involved and interested students sitting around a table and welcoming their guests, so I really do appreciate that warm welcome this morning. And I am in total bewilderment about how you get anything done around here. It is so incredibly beautiful. But that's tomorrow. Today they've got me working pretty hard. So I would like to spend the time, the rest of our time together, talking to you about a sort of whirlwind tour, that was not good, a whirlwind tour through Hayek scholarship, and then what some of the implications are for public policy questions and studying policy. I spend almost all of my time now doing healthcare policy and education policy, and as a result, I am sort of mired down all of the time in the complexity of trying to sort out really difficult questions for millions and millions of people. And my work on Hayek, which has also sort of paralleled this over the years, has made me very sympathetic to some of the arguments that he made. And I like to remind our policymakers all the time that while they want to do good, it may not be possible for them to do good from the perspective of the citizens and the policies that they pursue. So with that in mind, let me sort of take you through a little bit of Hayek's work. I hope I get this right. Today what I'm going to do is a couple of different things. I'm going to do a very brief history. There's quite a volume. If you're interested, you should let some of the faculty around here know about your interest in our Hayek camps. We do have them around the country, and they're great fun, and you do get to read from early Road to Serfdom all the way through fatal selections from Fatal Conceit. And so we will do a bit of that. I'm also going to then talk about some of the main themes that come out in Hayek's work and where I see his key contributions to the debate about understanding liberty and its role in flourishing societies and the creation of policy. And then finally I'm going to talk a little bit about implications for modern policy. I'll talk more about healthcare, but I also will introduce the notion of, in terms of the stimulus and other economic policies as well. So that's just a little bit of a roadmap of where we're going. Let me give you a little background. I love this picture. It's the greatest picture. That's the way I feel about Hayek. And you know, usually he looks kind of like a stern little man most of the time. So I feel really positive and very happy when I'm studying Hayek, and so I like that he feels particularly happy in this moment. Of course, we mostly know Hayek from his Nobel Prize in Economics in 1974. He also received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1991. And so he has been recognized for his scholarship in the modern era. But it took him a long way to get to that point. Most of us become familiar with him with his first major work in the American market, and that is Road to Serfdom. Before that, there are a number of economic essays and economic efforts, much of which become the basis for his selection for the Nobel Prize. But we become familiar with him with his 1944 book. It was actually published in Britain, and when they decided to bring it over here, they couldn't find a publisher. So anybody who's in academia who's having trouble on that front, rest assured, you're not alone in this. They went through many publishers who rejected it. Finally, and people as prominent as Frank Knight said, well, could have been done in half the time, not very interesting, kind of a screed, doesn't consider all the sides. So his reviews weren't the best, but they forged ahead and said, well, we think if we can get a really good person to do the introduction that maybe it'll sell up to 900 copies. It has now sold 350,000 copies or more, and that's just in the American market with that publisher. It has been published by a number of others as well. So we estimate that it could be, well over 500,000 to 1 million copies. Additionally, there was a Reader's Digest version that came out and a Look cartoon version. So if you can't dig through the whole big thing, then at least take a look at that. Sensory Order is published in 1945. Why I include this is we often think of Hayek as a moral philosopher or a political economist. In fact, this is a piece from his graduate work, and it is on neuroscience. And modern neuroscientists said he was pretty close in terms of looking at combinatorials. And if you read this book, you start to see where he gets that information and calculation problem that becomes the basis of his political theory. So I think it's worth taking a look at. Then, of course, we see a number of economic pieces: Individualism and Economic Order in 1948, Counter-Revolution of Science. Again, these are following on those themes and the very important nature of that for economics. And then we move to his sort of core political economic treatises. The Constitution of Liberty, I think, is one of the most important books out there, and he lays out the argument for why what he was arguing in Road to Serfdom really can't go forward, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Law, Legislation, and Liberty, I like that volume, that set of volumes, because it wraps it all up. It takes all that scholarship and puts it in a single, relatively brief set of 3 volumes, and so we get an insight into him. Then the last piece is the fatal conceit. Now, the fatal conceit is an interesting one because we are not sure how much of that was really Hayek. It was published posthumously. There was a conference on it early on, and there were quite a few criticisms about it. Many of people like James Buchanan and Mansur Olson said, "Do not publish this, it's not good stuff." And so he went back to work on it, and he did work on it for a very long time, but it was not complete, and it was brought out by his friend, colleague, scholar, Bartley, after his death. And so why that's important is right now is the 25th anniversary of the publication of Fatal Conceit. So it is again another anniversary moment that we can think about this. As I said, with the early years, we do know about it as the Road to Serfdom. It was a popular track. Even Hayek was a little bit embarrassed by some of the, certainly by all of the attention to it. He didn't see it in the way that he saw his other work necessarily, but it clearly spoke to people. And I think that that's where we see the breakthrough from academe and its narrow confines to speaking to people in the world about serious questions and serious problems. And so even though many took him on and criticized him within the academic arena, this has been an important kickoff that made him the scholar that gets to take on Keynes as we go on. So what does he argue in that? Well, he argues, first and foremost, he was trying to make a response to people who had said that it was capitalism and the failures of capitalism that had led to the rise of the Nazis and the actions that were taking place. He said, no, 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 no. It was the rise of the socialists and the effort to try to manage within the state and to bring out policy within the state. And so his argument was planning in an economy is so complex and so difficult to do. Now imagine 1930s, 1940s, much more challenging than today with our computerized system. So part of the problem he's referring to has gone away with the rise of computer capacity. But even still, he's saying, how can we put all this together and get all of the resources where they need to be and get the right products at the right price and to the population? We can't really work through that, some of that. Billions of combinations to run through when you start to put different people together with different products and different preferences. And how are you going to possibly do that? When you try to, because planners do not want to fail, they're good of heart, they want to do well by their populations and by their people frequently, and as a result, they try and make the problem a little simpler. So instead of recognizing the variety and the diversity that is us, they want us to get in line so they can offer us choices that are then manageable within the political system. And for people that think that this won't happen with good-spirited people, later remember this when we turn to Obamacare. And I'm going to show you the red tape tower of how this works out. We want to compress these ideas so that we can make sure that people understand the options that are available to them. So think mandated benefit plans that you can compare in an exchange. Instead of the variety of a market, we now boil it down to everybody has to have these services, because if you leave out that service, then your system isn't exactly comparable to the next system. And so how do we know you're not trying to cheat with that? And so we want, as we move as planners, to do this. So over time, Hayek's fear was this would become a totalitarian effort, that the choices would get smaller and smaller, the problems would get bigger and bigger, and eventually it would cause a complete coercion and repression. So this is what his argument says, that if in fact you go down the planning route, you are bound to get to the level of authoritarianism or totalitarianism. Part of the difficulty is, in that type of a society, we have to compare the social good, what is good for all, against individual interests. We have to create the social good out of those individual interests. And that always creates a bit of a problem in trying to figure out how we weight different people's attitudes, how much information they have, are they making fully informed choices, what happens when tomorrow they want something different, think fashion. Obviously, just at the time the planner gets it right, everybody changes and moves around. And then what do? They have to start over and come up with new things. So it is a huge challenge for them. And he believed that this would be what would lead to the problem of totalitarianism. The other problem is the social choice problem. That, again, in the way that we define these in the public arena, note, when you go to the marketplace and you're picking out toothpaste, in certain societies that are altogether planned, there might not be a lot of choices for toothpaste. There may be toothpaste, but you can bet there are not going to be toothpaste like if you go down the road to the grocery store here, where literally an entire wall will exist of different options to brush your teeth with. In essence, they're all doing the same thing. So why couldn't we just have 3 or 4? Wouldn't that be a lot easier and take up a lot less shelf space? But the market says, no, we can't have 3 or 4, because there are young people that want things that sparkle in this way, and there are old people whose teeth get sensitive, and there are people who have dentures, and there are a variety of things. And so we need to have a variety of options, and the market can do that. And if one of them goes away, we don't even notice. They notice, they live that problem, but the rest of us, we don't have to worry our little heads about it, because there will be 6 others to substitute for it later. So that was the problem that he lays out as he's looking at this road to serfdom. So that's early. He's getting this right then. But he's doing it in a kind of fast and loose way, and people are not quite convinced that it's real science and that it's there. And so he spent the rest of his life, I think, trying to make the case that this was so general and so much a part of society that it was impossible to avoid, no matter how good intentioned the politicians and policymakers were. And this is probably his most famous work, and if you're going to read something in terms of academic work, if you're going to read something, this is definitely the piece to read. It's his AER piece on the use of knowledge in society, and this is where he academically lays out the dispersion of information and knowledge and how when we come together. And so I've just put a couple quotes up here, and I'm happy to leave my PowerPoints later, but these are quotes out of that piece to sort of talk about what it is that he's concerned with here. And down here, to assume all the knowledge to be given to a single mind in the same manner in which we assume it to be given to us as the explaining economists is to assume the problem away and to disregard everything that is important and significant in the real world. So while computational economics and rational choice and economic calculation was moving forward and advancing incredibly the field, he worried that it was losing some of the reality that made the jump over to policy from the academic world into the planning world a bit too easy. If you make it look like you can do it on a page with a few equations, then somebody's going to want to do it. And that was one of Hayek's real concerns and real worries. As I said, as he moved through his career, he starts, and he sees this as one of his most important books, The Constitution of Liberty. It clearly is his effort to try and take on the political components, the constitutional components of the questions that he had raised. One of the critiques that he faced was, you've told us why we can't do this, but you haven't given us another solution. You haven't given us an answer. And one of the sort of fun things about law, legislation, and liberty is, in the third volume, he does. He actually lays out a model constitution for his readers. It's a terrible model constitution, I gotta say. It's one of the, it makes, you know, it's like fingernails on a blackboard. You just read it and go. It's got things like, we'll join clubs, and men will join, and at later year then women will join, so that there can be pairings, and that legislators will only happen later in life when they have got a certain level of experience from living in the world. And so he has all these plans, and judges are extraordinarily important in it. He trusted judges through his whole life. But in doing that, what it suggests is this is one way that he thought that perhaps you could try and get at some of the goals that he sought in constraining government and creating a really free way of still having government. But as soon as you start to write these things down, it also points out the challenge that exists in doing that action. Even Hayek, who is super smart and spent a lifetime working on this, when he took his hand to it and tried to design one for himself, we see it kind of got some questionable components to it. I'm not sure that's, he didn't even take this into account. Or what about the argument he raised here in Constitution of Liberty? Or what about this issue from use of knowledge? That wouldn't work with his design. So as soon as he takes a tack at it, we can target him too. And I think it speaks to the challenge of trying to do this constitutionally in sort of a top-down way. That you do have to do it in a bottom-up, spontaneous order way, as he argued. So in Constitution of Liberty, he really gets at that. What is the role of freedom in society? Why do we need freedom? And he argued freedom was essential for us, whether we wanted to pursue our own goals or pursue the goals of others. It was important because it was how options and possibilities would be discovered. It was our interaction freely with one another that would result in more positive outcomes emerging and us moving along that path. He also believed you had to have failure, that as you moved along in this creation of social order, that failing was as critical as winning was in those, because it sent signals back to people that might not be the way we want to go. And so his notions, as we look at the notions, we'll start to see some of this argument laid out. He also has a very critical argument that's included here, and that is that freedom and responsibility cannot be separated. Again, many people were arguing for freer systems, but what Hayek added to the mix and kept pounding home is, you can only have that freedom if you are willing to accept the consequences that come with those free actions. In other words, you're going to have to pay the price for your own failures. And that is the part that I think runs most hard up against our desire in the modern society to protect people from the bad things that can happen to them. And this is the challenge. People listen or read about Hayek and say, yeah, that's right. that makes sense. But when their circumstance turns bad, they lose their job, they're looking for things like protections. And so theoretically, he wins. On the practical aspect, I'm not so sure. And so, again, we'll take this up at greater length. Again, as I said, the 3 volumes, just a quick overview. It is the culmination of his work. He did see that he wanted to lay it down. He took almost a decade to complete the 3 volumes. And so as he moved through it, he thought it would be his final culminating work. And so a lot of Hayek scholars see it that way. Almost all Hayek scholars like one book, not this book as much. So Road to Serfdom, or Fatal Conceit, or Constitution of Liberty, or some of his economics work. They will pick a different one, but this is the one that brings them all together. They will pick a different one because if you have 500 pages to go through one part of what is being laid out in these, you can do a much more detailed consideration of it. And so I like it because it does give students a sort of window into it. He also sees that in this, he develops this notion that man is rule following. And one of the questions is where the rules come from. For Hayek, they're embedded in society. They're embedded in our social communities and in our culture. And so as we follow these rules, we don't have to keep calculating all of the time. He's trying to get around that calculation problem that we talked about earlier, and he starts laying it out here. He develops the notion, which is brought up from the earlier work, on spontaneous orders and how such orders contrast with planned orders. So he's going to look at the grown order, grown law, versus legislation, and which one is a more preferred in society. Now, one of the things that libertarians have trouble with Hayek on is he does have the capacity for legislation in his work. He gives the power to government to coerce people and to create legislation that will move them back when they've gotten down a wrong path. So because he gives that capacity to his governing system, a lot of people worry that that capacity cannot be contained. And I think that is one of the challenging parts that Hayek faces in laying out this logic. So all people, all planners, for example, all people in government never see that they're trying to be coercive and do, really change the game. They're just correcting mistakes that exist. And as a result, they never see their legislation as stepping over the boundaries of what Hayek would permit. And so how do you contain a government that you've given corrective capacity to? That is the underlying dilemma that I think we continually face in Hayek's work. So let's look at some of the concepts pulled out of all of this different work and see if we can sort of hammer them down and then apply them just quickly to a couple of policy areas. Hayek's concept of liberty is largely a negative concept. It is freedom from coercion. You cannot be used to do the work of someone else, to pursue the goals of someone else. So it is a negative form of liberty that he sees as essential in society. Individuals are coerced under Hayek's thought when they are prevented from charting their own course. This is why freedom is so essential, is that discovery process. Again, I think this comes from his work on neuroscience. I think it comes from some of his science in other arenas. The notion that discovery will emerge as things interact and that you couldn't possibly foresee them. And so how do we get that into place? And that's why liberty is, you have to be able to do things. Even if you do them wrong, you have to be able to do them. And all of that will be enhance not just society, but also enhance you as a person. So a notion of flourishing comes out. Not a complete notion. I can tell you, political philosophers that read Hayek and have been in my Hayek boot camp, you know, I come and I'm like, Hayek, yay, Hayek, you know, and they come and go, so sloppy, so, you know, so unclear here, and, you know, they go nuts because he's just not that careful on some of the things that a moral philosopher would be extraordinarily careful about. He's an economist. At the end of the day, I think he's a very important and very sensible economist, but he is squishy sometimes, and I didn't even know how squishy he was till I started teaching interacting. These are, you learn as much as you ever give out in those settings. But so this is his notion. It's because we can't know that. Just like the moral philosophers, he doesn't want to go down that path of this is the right, this is the way. So it's going to be this sort of a negative concept. Choice empowers individuals, it improves them, but there's another way we can think about it. It may just be needed because of man's ignorance. So again, this is one of those areas where the political philosophers might rub up against and sort of want to tussle a little bit with Hayek. He doesn't need it to be worthwhile in any sort of flourishing way to do the work that he wants it to do. It can simply mean that you're going to make mistakes. If you don't have freedom to make mistakes, then we're not going to find out those are mistakes, and we're going to make a lot of social mistakes. So again, that notion of we're on a progressive path, we're on a always moving in this direction, it's not as clear from his work that he thinks everything's going to turn out rosy and charming at the end. That does raise a question. You know, one of the things he does understand, and that he plays out in several of his volumes, is this last one, and that is, if you cannot be bad, can you be good? And so one of the things that chafed against Hayek with the totalitarian state was, even if you're planning for the best possible outcomes, what difference does it make if it's not freely chosen by you? In other words, forced goodness is not goodness. And so, again, you can imagine that some of the moral philosophers, when he gets into this and doesn't quite explore it enough, might have some challenges with him. What he ends up with, and what his greatest contribution is, this notion of an evolutionary approach or spontaneous order. That society, especially if you look at a market, those hundreds of toothpaste tubes in this grocery store create an order in the grocery store knowing what to order, the company knowing what to price, the ones going out of business, the other ones getting much bigger and spinning off 3 different brands. All of that happens without anybody having to figure it out. And that happens out of just our little minor interactions with one another, that we know we don't like, my kids won't use that toothpaste, or that one's really fabulous, or that one dulled my teeth, or I got too sensitive, or whatever it might be. We don't need to figure that out at the top, we just figure it out at the bottom. As a result, that doesn't happen on day one. It happens with those interactions. So, toothpaste goes on the shelf, store owner says, I'm going to put it there, but you see it in the clearance bin in a month. Nobody's buying this toothpaste. It's either priced incorrectly, it's not marketed correctly, it's not good, whatever it might be. For some reason, they're not going to waste their time anymore on it. And so it's in the clearance bin, it's off the shelf. That happened without anybody really having to do it. And to the sad, sad result of the poor person that put their toothpaste that's no longer on the shelf there, because they're likely to go out of business. So he understood that and develops that as a way of trying to explain some of the stuff that's going on. Now, equality is one of these issues that whenever we turn to the design of states and the design of policies and so on, equality is an essential feature of certainly Western democratic systems. And so, as a result, we want whatever we come up with to speak to this issue. Well, Hayek does not speak a lot to the issue. He speaks to the issue in terms of the rule of law and due process. He does not speak in terms of satisfaction to those that want more equal outcomes. Now, his argument is, in the long run, that will result in those more equal outcomes, where it will be equal to the extent it is deserved. So just desserts are part of Hayek's thinking on this, that it's not simply removed from it. But as I said, he needs losers in his spontaneous order because they send information. Those winners and losers are constantly sending these information chains. And so politics does not deal well with that notion. We don't like to stand up and go, well, sorry, you're going to have to stay unemployed a little longer because, you know, the market's clearing and it's just going to take some time. And I know your family needs help, but we're not going to step in and intervene in that way. Politicians do not like taking statements like that. And so this kind of a strategy always, frequently will get derailed in that as we move in. It leads us to this notion where policy enters in a lot, human security. For Hayek, he does have social policies that provide security, surprisingly to a lot of people. Having read The Road to Serfdom, a lot of people expect that Hayek is, on the front lines of we do nothing, the smallest state possible. Then they read the Constitution of Liberty, and the whole last part of that has a variety of policies outlined that protect the poor, protect individuals. It's not huge by today's standards, but in 1960, it's a whole lot further down the road than I think you would expect someone like Hayek to have proposed. And so guaranteeing everyone a position is not part of the logic, but providing a minimum. What he thought of in doing this was to move it down to smaller communities, where the linkage between the freedom and responsibility dyad could be maintained. If you are getting money from the federal government sent out to California, there's almost no limit to how much you can ask for in those kinds of settings, because that seems very distant, and if you don't ask for it, maybe Utah will, or New York, or somebody else, and so you might as well get yours, because you're going to end up paying for it either way. Whereas when it's closer in your community, decisions whether or not to raise taxes to create this library, that will be more cognizant of the consequence of us making that kind of a decision there. So the further the coercion is hidden, the more problem it creates for Hayek. So he wants to keep it at that level. So of course he would support, I think, federalism and smaller government in that logic. There are also limits on social action. Because there's complexity, we do need some degree of planning. He understood that. It's why he puts in the notion of legislation to correct along the way and get us back when in fact nature has taken us, or interactions have taken us down one path, and that's the right path for us. There may still be sort of contradictions or other messiness in that policy that could be cleaned up with good legislation. So he sees that role for social action. He doesn't speak as much to these issues. The role of the entrepreneur, for example, in trying to guide us in this way. He focuses his attention more on the state and doesn't look at, well, what about risk takers that lead us in this way? But he does see a role for, obviously I think they are consistent with his logic, and certainly could play this role instead of social planners. This last point about the trial and error with a ratchet, one of the things we debate every year at Hayek Camp is whether or not Hayek is a progressive, in the sense that we can never go backwards. We're always doing better than we were, so we're always, we see mistakes and we don't go there and we only go here. So knowledge is always progressive in this fashion. And if in fact we can go down wrong paths frequently or consistently or continue and go in circles in some way, then perhaps the logic that he outlines will not work as effectively. Anyway, and that's the point of law versus legislation, the made law versus the natural law that emerges, and the combination that is, and how dynamic it is. I want to end though, I want to get to some policy things, and I want to leave a few minutes for questions, and we started just a little bit late. So let me just give you a couple of examples here, and then I'll turn to Obamacare for a minute. First of all, the challenge for policymakers, there are always trade-offs. So, healthy behaviors. In my world of healthcare policy, this is everything. And when you are a fat woman that works in the field of health policy, let me tell you, you are the poster child for everyone to tell a lecture to. You must be eating wrong and not exercising enough. So I sit in these meetings where everybody says that, going, yeah, I know, I'm the poster child. Anyway, so, what should they do? Should they get me up at 6 a.m. and get me down on the quad doing my jumping jacks and making sure, do I have to sign in every night and tell them what I ate that day? Well, there'll be Twinkie police in the quad. This is one of the things that I think, if in fact you want things to go the way we think science tells us is an improved way, then those are the kind of strategies you get to. And IPAB, the death panels and all the controversy that surrounded the death panels in the recent health bill. Do I think that they're going to be like, There are, and actually, there have been those death panels in Great Britain and stuff. It's not like Sarah Palin makes these things up. These things have existed, and they do them based on the cost. They do them here based on the cost. You can have services that may improve that are very, very costly that can be made optional in your insurance plans and things. And they may be able to encourage you if you have lower cholesterol, if you have certain things because you're working on them, you get your diabetes treatments and you are getting your education, we can improve it. Now this, of course, would make Hayek's head spin on its axis, I think. Because he understood that once you take this step down, the next step down, the next step down, you are at the state that was the road to serfdom for Hayek. Now, the Nutty Putty Cave, you wouldn't have any reason to know that, but the Nutty Putty Cave is a cave in Utah, and of course, it was a cave that was spelunker fan favorite. They would go there, but it was a dangerous cave. And of course, some young, not so sensible people went to the Nutty Putty Cave and got stuck and died in the Nutty Putty Cave. So of course, the Nutty Putty Cave must be buried. So they have blocked the entrance to the Nutty Putty Cave. That's the kind of solution. Now, when the people died in it, and the children died, and the stories were written, everybody was extraordinarily sympathetic and really worried. And it's not as if climbing, spelunking is an essential service of life that you have to do. And so really, what is the cost to cutting off the Nutty Putty spelunkers from going in there? I also live in avalanche territory in the ski resorts, and every year the avalanche groups come out and say, don't go backcountry skiing, it's just awful, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And of course, all of them go backcountry skiing because it's really fun. And, if you're an adventurer, that's what you want to do. Of course, the people that have to go find them and tell their parents and all the horrible things don't want to do it. But it continues to be incredibly fun and exciting, and so they continue to do it. And that is the challenge of society. Once we become responsible for people being safe, we also become responsible to coerce or constrain them to the behaviors we think could. The mortgage crisis. You put all the rules on, nobody can get a loan. So all of these things, moral hazard and adverse selection come out, and that becomes the real problem. So I only got a couple slides on policy. I could go on for eternity on healthcare at this point, but I'm not going to. But I'm happy to chat with anybody about it at greater length. But I did want to point out a couple of things. This is Hayek's worst nightmare. He's writing Road to Serfdoms in heaven somewhere about this plan that's going forward. Now, it's a couple of different parts, And honestly, you can see the different parts of Hayek coming out of it. PPA, Patient Protection Act. These are the insurance reforms that went into place earlier in the process. 26-year-olds can still be on their parents' coverage. These are kind of nice things. And they were put in place in part. They raised costs, there's no doubt about that. But they were put in place because the market really didn't do very well at addressing some of these issues. Now there's reasons. It's not because insurers are evil. It is rather that if in fact you're going to be with me during this time and then you're going to be with another insurer when you're low cost, I'm going to go out of business. So I have to now try and figure out, relative to my competitors, systems that keep people in the same insurance plan through their life balance out the cheap times and the expensive times over a lifetime of premium. It's a whole lot easier to do. That's not the system that we have in the United States, and as a result, they start to game the system a little. So some of the reforms that went in place there were kind of cheap solutions and kind of okay, and maybe that's like Hayek's legislation. I don't think he'd go that far, but maybe they could be considered in that way. Now the second piece, the ACA, the part we're just going to get to see this coming year, he'd hate that because it's a nightmare. Insurance mandates and subsidies, it creates all of the adverse selections. The regulation of the current market, again, I want you to have the right kind of insurance for you. And you weren't buying all the things you needed because you couldn't afford to buy all the things you needed. But now we want you to have this policy. And so it has to include this. And of course, there are interest groups lining up to say, well, you have to have autism care in there. And you have to have this, surgery for these kinds of weight disorders. And you have to have... People with interests are going to line up. In a private market, they'd buy that, and you wouldn't. And theirs would be extraordinarily expensive, and yours would be quite cheap. Sharing it across creates this kind of circumstance that he would hate. And the reason is planners have to figure what is essential. Because they're not including everything in these essential benefit packages. Lots of people have lots of policies that go beyond that. Why is this essential versus not? And it has to do more with politics rather than just the science of medicine. And then, of course, the exchanges. We will create marketplaces for people to compare. But if people are going to compare, they have to compare apples to apples. They can't compare apples to oranges. Toothpaste all has to have the same things. Otherwise, you might buy a toothpaste that doesn't have what you need later. So we're going to put minimum benefits in an exchange, which then constrains your choice in those things. It's basically, I think, taxes, which is Hayek's term for made law on steroids. And the red tape tower is a perfect example of why I say that can be true. This here is McConnell's red tape tower. Senator McConnell was speaking on the 3rd anniversary of the passage of PPACA and wanted to have a demonstration of what this policy was looking like. Now many people, I carry the 2,700 pages of the original bill to class to demonstrate, but that wasn't enough for them, so they printed off all of the regulations that are in place as of now, which let me tell you, there will be far more before the exchanges are fully functional. And this is the tower. It's over 20,000 pages of regulation, and we have not seen any of the implementation of it yet. And they wrapped it up with a red bow, and you can follow it on Twitter, or you can be its Facebook friend, or like it on Facebook. And I think Hayek would love the fact that in the modern world, it's not just a thing, it can actually have a Twitter page. I didn't follow it. I didn't go on it. I thought, I have lots to do. I just can't go click and sure, let's follow the red tape tower. Where's it going today? Anyway, I just think it's great. It's such a visual. I love it. Okay, you don't think it's as funny, but I totally do. I love Hayek, and I think that's totally amusing. Anyway, and here's just one last one, and I'll leave you with this, and that is TARP. I mean, think about the decisions that were made. First of all, TARP was a Troubled Asset Release Program passed in 2008, not by President Obama, but under President Bush in the last days his administration. Even that, which, you know, first of all, goes way beyond what we would think President Bush would support or something as the Republican, they put $700 billion. They had no idea. How much is this going to cost? We have no idea. If having it make it cost less, and so that's part of it, but they didn't know. They just threw a bunch of money at it and hoped it would get us past to the next piece. Then we see how, well, now we'll have to start to plan around it. The Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, because they've been naughty, and so if we're going to give them money and save them, provide this security, well, they have to pay a price for the security, and so we're going to have to regulate them. We reduced it to $475 billion, that's the good news, but we also created this concept of too big to fail, the idea that now you are exempt from the loser side of the equation that Hayek thought was so incredibly necessary. What do you expect their behavior to be in the future? Do you think social planners will be able to get enough information about what they're doing on their daily basis in large banks too big to fail to keep them in line? I would argue no. I think Hayek would argue no as well. And then finally, the notion of shovel-ready. Again, it is testimony to the fact that planners wanted to get money out there doing things that would turn it around, just as we saw in the Great Depression. But it's hard. It's not easy to do. There weren't shovel-ready jobs out there at the time that met the criteria. There were probably plenty of real shovel-ready jobs, but the reality is when you're spending government money, you have to spend it with rules and regulations because it's other people's money. And as a result, they couldn't get that money out there, and we have seen a very slow recovery coming out of it. And with that, I'm going to just leave you my conclusions. He contributed to our understanding and the limits of human capacity to control social interactions. It is a problem of knowledge, a problem of foresight, and a problem of control. And if you haven't seen it and you haven't been there, if you get a chance to go and see Fear the Boom and the Bust, it's done by Econ Stories. Skip this. Skip this, all right. I'm just going to show you the first seconds. They say it all. Can you hear it?
No.
Of course you are. F-A Hayek with an H. And I'll leave it there. That sort of says it all. F-A Hayek with an H. Just so you remember. Go watch the rest of it. It's great fun. There's another one by Econ Stories on them as well. And they rap. I don't know if you've seen it. If you want, you can come up afterwards. Anyway, with that, thank you. I'll open it up for questions.
One or two questions, and then in the reception we can continue the conversation. So, who has one or two questions? Okay, Jordan.
So it seems that the main thrust of Hayek's argument against government planning is that governments lack sufficient information about the spontaneous order to properly plan, and therefore any attempt at planning is going to result in the suppression of one person's will, basically, at the expense of another. What I'm curious about then is how Hayek would view a monopolistic situation in private industry. Would he say that because it arose out of the spontaneous order, it's okay, or would he say that would he say that there's a parallel with government planning in that it's limiting consumer choice and therefore not okay?
I think he falls somewhere in between. He can see the possibility of private problems, which is why he gives corrective power to the state. He does understand coercion is the key. And so a coal mining town where there's a company store and in essence people are basically enslaved would be completely inconsistent with Hayek's theory. However, he also sees that monopolies, like most economists, understand monopolies are rarely natural monopolies. They tend to be government-sustained monopolies when they go on longer. That they are temporary in the sense that there may be a period of time where they have great clout, but over time, as long as those prices stay high that they're able to get, others will move in and provide alternative or substitute products that will erode their base as a monopolist. And there are only a few sectors where that's not possible naturally, usually utilities and other kinds of things, where some regulation might be appropriate. But often that regulation tends to reinforce that power base because of the collusion that occurs or the rent seeking that occurs between the regulated and the government versus the average citizen and their knowledge about what's actually going on. So the question is, how much should it cost for a B-1 bomber? Who knows? You know, if you're the only manufacturer of these kinds of things, then you can charge amounts that may not be consistent with market prices, and it may be in the interest of politicians as well. And so I think that's where he would come down on it. Did that answer your question? Okay.
So one more question, or we'll just move to the reception? I think we're ready for the reception then. Okay, thank you.